This is KVR, Kaijuvision Radio, Episode 40, Varan. Hello Kaiju and tokusatsu fans, and welcome to Kaijuvision Radio, a podcast about the appreciation of kaiju and tokusatsu movies and discovering their historical and cultural value. I'm Brian Scherschel.
And I'm John LeMay.
And that's right, listeners, and with us today is John LeMay, writer of many nonfiction kaiju books, two which I now have on my bookshelf and have read, and they're very good, and they're very enlightening about just learning about what's behind the scenes with a lot of these movies. Thank you for joining us, and I'm sure the listeners will enjoy this episode.
Well, thank you, Brian. I'm glad to be your guest co-host for this episode.
In this episode, we will be covering the 1958 film Varan, or Daikaiju Varan, and also that American version, Varan the Unbelievable. Yes, so we need to do this very last black and white movie of the season on Varan, which is an underestimated movie, I think, at least the Japanese version is. The related topic for this episode is the Hisabetsu-Buraku. But before we start discussing and analyzing this wonderful film, I will be reading the film description, which is part 1 of the podcast. It is our original method to present the facts about the movies. You're listening to KVR, Kaijuvision Radio. Varan is a force of nature. He is a trifibian prehistoric dinosaur classified as a varanopod, resembling both the Draco genus of flying dragons and the Varanus genus of monitor lizards, among other things. The villagers refer to him as mountain god Baradagi. He's violent towards humans and destructive when provoked. Dr. Kenji Uozaki is an enterprising entomologist sent to Western Tohoku to figure out what happened to 2 researchers who were killed under mysterious circumstances while in the same area. Yuriko Shinjo is an independent and capable reporter and the sister of one of the researchers who was killed. She and fellow reporter Motohiko Horiguchi document the extraordinary events that unfold. Dr. Sugimoto is an adept scientist leading the effort to find a way to neutralize Varan. Assisting him is Dr. Fujimura, a talented scientist who works with explosives. The human and kaiju plots are unified. Virtually everything the human characters do is related to the kaiju. Varan is the issue at hand. First they launch chemicals into the saltwater lake that Varan is in, with no effect. They then use tanks and 24 twin rocket cars, then fighter jets, then naval artillery, then depth charges, then fighter jets, 24 twin rocket cars, and tanks once again, once Varan arrives at Haneda. Dr. Fujimura's dam-busting bombs are loaded into an army vehicle and detonated under Varan, causing some injury, but he continues on his path of destruction. The problem is finally solved when more of the dam-busting bombs are attached to parachutes with flares. Varan, attracted to the light from the flares, eats the bombs, which then detonate inside him. After he retreats to the ocean, the final bomb explodes, killing him. The story, written by Ken Kuronoma and screenplay by new Toho writer Shinichi Sekizawa, is a simple and focused story with some of Sekizawa's trademarks: humor, some archetypal characters that reappear often in later stories, and a plot that doesn't get bogged down in details. Budget figures are not available for the film, but there is not as much money or care put into this as it was a made-for-TV production originally. The special effects, headed by Eiji Tsuburaya, are not as great this time around, and it was to be a direct-to-television production. The overall quality is below average, comparable to Godzilla Raids Again, lacking polish in places. The lake area towards the beginning of the movie is good, and the outdoor photography in the wilderness. Akira Ikafube's music is above average and is used in future films. Being a Sekizawa script, the movie has a lighter tone than previous Toho Kaiju entries like the original Godzilla and Rodan. There is a moderate level of gravity because Varan is treated as a serious threat. There is a tense atmosphere in the movie, especially leading up to Varan's appearance. But the formulaic aspects of the rest of the movie don't build on that as much. Between reality and fantasy, it's more on the side of depicting extraordinary events in a realistic setting. Varan is not a stylistically experimental film, as it utilizes many existing kaiju tropes. However, Varan, created by Ken Kuronoma and first portrayed by Hiro Nakajima, is a relatively experimental kaiju, given his ability to swim in water, glide in air, and walk on land. The film reinforces the style of Godzilla Raids Again, with its similar plot elements and lighter tone compared to most other 50s kaiju movies. Varan is a unique film in that it was designed originally as a made-for-TV production in cooperation with American company ABC. It was intended for television audiences in Japan and in the US, and it's safe to assume that it was targeted to an audience interested in kaiju films, as this audience was growing. It's a safe and standard monster-on-the-loose film that fits into the medium it was meant for. The film was released in Japan on October 14, 1958. Box office and earnings figures for this film were not readily available, but it is safe to say it wasn't a hugely successful film. However, the American version made good money because it was bought very cheaply due to the favorable exchange rate. It doesn't have as much of a fan following, though there is a sizable amount of the fan base that likes the kaiju. Tokyo Shock released the Japanese version on DVD in 2005. The Japanese version is rated 5.6 on That Movie Database, and the American version is rated 5.0. Somehow. The American version of this movie is famously bad. The original 87-minute movie was reduced to 70 minutes. It was created by the Corey Film Corporation. It stars Myron Healey, among other TV actors. Besides making massive cuts and concentrating on the Myron Healey character, some radical changes done to the American version include dubbing Varan's roar, cutting the part where Varan glides through the air, having much of the events in the movie take place on an island, and only referencing Varan as Obaki. It was released in American theaters on December 7, 1962 by Crown International Pictures on a double bill with First Spaceship on Venus. The forces at play include the clash between civilized humanity versus primitive, isolated, and superstitious natives in the natural world. Varan's death is portrayed as yet another win for humanity in its conquest of Earth. The movie places significant faith in the ability of science to be able to solve problems that threaten humanity. The moral of the story is that even though humanity has entered the space age, there are still undiscovered places, people, and things here on Earth. The movie ends with the narration saying, "After a desperate struggle, man has won another victory." That concludes part 1. You're listening to KVR, Kaijuvision Radio. Part 2 of the podcast is the opinion and discussion section. First, we'll say about how we encountered this film for the first time. I saw Varan for the first time in about late 2000s. I don't remember exactly what year. I think I just saw it once, and it was something that I thought, okay, that was pretty good. And then I just not forgot about it, but just sort of shelved it. And I know it was the Japanese version because the American version is so radically different than what the other one is. And so I have probably watched it 5, 6, 7 times now in the past couple of weeks preparing for this episode. This isn't really one that I watched all that much, but I still like it.
I first heard of Varan through Ian Thorne's Godzilla book. So for me, Varan was definitely the most mysterious of all of Toho's monsters. And the only other thing I really knew about Varan was he was in one movie, and he was also in Destroy All Monsters, which I didn't see for many years. So this will tell you what I really think of Varan. I don't remember whether I saw the Japanese version first or the American version, but I know probably when I was around 11 years old, I got a bootleg Japanese version that I watched, without subtitles. So I really couldn't appreciate it. It was kind of boring. And I know at some point I found the VHS for Varan the Unbelievable at Suncoast Video back in the days of VHS, and I watched that, and I don't think I was terribly impressed with that either.
The making of this film is way different from a lot of the rest of these that I've done, whether it's been Godzilla or whether it's been Toho Tokusatsu. So I wanted to see, because you know a lot about this, John, because you did an article in GFan about this just recently, and that was very enlightening. But the story behind this is actually a lot more interesting than the story itself in the movie.
Yes, it's definitely a unique situation. Varan was potentially Toho's first U.S.-Japan co-production. It ultimately didn't go through that way. But an American producer of television movies, we don't actually know for sure who it was, but the best bet is ABC. They approached Toho about doing a made-for-TV movie about a giant monster. Part of the reason why Varan's story is so simple is because, again, they thought it was going to be a simple 4-part miniseries. Ken Kuronuma, he has something interesting to say about the writing process of the film. Kuronuma says, quote, Rodan had arrived in the U.S., and a request came from America to Toho. Tomoyuki Tanaka approached me, asking me to come up with something, anything. So Kuronuma's quote sounds kind of desperate, like, please come up with something quick. And same thing with Shinichi Sekizawa. Koji Kajita, the assistant director, says, quote, we told Sekizawa to keep it basic and simple. It was fun. And that's really what Varan is, very basic and simple. Now, our confusion with Varan comes with how many episodes did they really want this proposed miniseries to comprise of? And Ishiro Honda himself said, quote, we had been shooting based on the premise of 3 episodes, end quote. Now, as I've researched this, I think Honda, he was, misremembering. I've recently found some confirmation in a Japanese magazine called Tokusatsu Haiho that it was for a fact going to be 4 episodes, like a 4-episode miniseries. And to kind of go into more detail, so adding to the confusion on this miniseries is if you have the Varan the Unbelievable DVD from Media Blasters, you will actually see a TV version of Varan, and that was never actually aired. It was created just for the DVD. It's a special TV version of Varan. It runs 54 minutes, and if you actually watch it, you can tell it's actually 2 distinct episodes split into 2. That confuses people, because if it was supposed to be a 4-part series, then why are there just 2 on this DVD? So had it been actually in 4 parts, it would have been a lot longer. If you watch the special feature on the DVD of the TV version, you'll notice it has additional sequences. Now, the footage itself is lost, but the audio remains, so you'll hear audio from characters that you can't see talking about Varan emerging from the lake. So extra footage was shot just for the TV version, and I believe what happened was in the middle of production, they decided to make it a feature film, and they quit shooting the additional footage for the TV version. So that's why, in the end, Toho only had like a 2-part as opposed to a 4-part. And after they finished shooting the film, and Brian and I will digress and talk about when it switched from being a television series to a film. But Toho, actually, when they had finished shooting the movie, they did still send 2 episodes to America. It was called Varan Appears for Part 1 and Varan's Counterattack for Part 2. And it was never ever aired anywhere. And again, that's why it appears on the DVD just as a special feature.
Yeah, so there's actually 3 versions of this movie. Because it's got the American version, the Japanese version, and then this interesting TV version too.
Yes.
54 minutes, that's kind of short, and then dividing that into 2.
And again, just to reiterate, what's so interesting, again, if you watch it, it's like an extended version of the sequence where Varan emerges from the lake. So in other words, there's technically not additional scenes, but additional audio scenes within this particular segment. So it would have been extended by quite a bit had they completed it.
When I was watching even just the Japanese version of this, it seems like there was kind of a back and forth, a rhythm to this movie. I can see how you could divide it up and it would still be entertaining. Because we have lull in the action, and then we get some nice action for a while, and then we go out of that, and then we go to more action, and then we go out of that, and then it's like, I think 4 times that happens. Because we have our air battle, we have the naval battle, we have the first battle when he emerges from the lake, and then the very ending part in the airport. But it seems like there's... if this was divided into 2 parts on this TV part, then it would make sense because the action would be balanced between the 2. instead of having the action, towards the end, because some of the Godzilla movies, for instance, they have all of this action in the last half hour, which would be, like the second half if it was a TV production. So it would be really weird to watch the first half and have almost nothing happen. But in this, there's action sort of evenly dispersed throughout.
That's exactly right. And I have right in front of me, actually, and this is relatively new information from Japan and Tokusatsu Haiho. It has the breakdown of all 4 episodes. So episode 1, Varan Appears, was originally just supposed to be Varan emerging from the lake. He destroys the village. He goes back in. Episode 2, Raid of Varan, is that whole sequence where Varan emerges for the second time, and he fights the military out in the forest, and then, he takes off into the sky, and that's the end of part 2. Episode 3 was to be Varan Advances, and that's, like you said, where that whole swim to Tokyo, fighting the Navy happens, and then finally part 4, Varan's counterattack, is that big climax at Haneda Airport.
You can tell, there's just kind of a rhythm, which is nice, though, because this movie doesn't have a lot, in the story. It's almost like I want to just grade this movie on a curve.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, it was intended for television for the most part, and when it was being all planned out and everything, and that just wasn't the case with pretty much all these Godzilla movies that have already been covered on Kaijuvision, and then they weren't planned in this way, and then with this process. Well, I know you can clear this up for me, but when I was looking on IMDb, it almost made the impression that it was filmed one way in the beginning. They said that it went from Academy up to Toho Panscope, which implies that it was stretched. But then I read other stuff and I'm like, wait a minute, this is saying it was cropped, and that's what it looks like when I'm looking at it on the screen, is that it was cropped. So maybe you can shed some light on this.
Sure, cropped is exactly right, and the nice thing is we can get it from Ishiro Honda himself. He told David Milner in Cult Movies, quote, "After we had shot 5 or 6 scenes in the standard 35mm format required for television, or in other words, full screen, my words, Toho decided to show the movie in theaters as well as on television. We at first planned to simply reshoot the scenes in the wider cinemascope format used in theaters, but we were in a rush. So we just cropped the existing film to fit the cinemascope format," end quote. So in simpler terms, it's basically the opposite of pan and scan. Pan and scan is where you have a widescreen film, you chop off the edges to make it fit what used to be the old square TVs. But in Varan's case, they actually cut off the top and the bottom of the screen to convert it into widescreen. And Tokusatsu Haiho actually has some of the original full screen film cells that they published images of in the recent issues. So it's a proven fact. Varan was shot in, the Academy ratio or full screen. And
that also gets us to the part about how rushed this movie was too, which is another reason why I almost want to grade this movie on a curve, is because they didn't have a bunch of time to throw this together. I mean, a lot of these Godzilla movies, they weren't even made in all that, long of a time. In the mid-60s, they were just, cranking these things out like three in a year.
Yeah, and that's another, there's another good Hondo quote about how rushed this movie was. He says, quote, "This change was forced upon us. We were shooting things so that they looked big and powerful on the small screen. But suddenly we had to take the same footage and try to make the same impression for the big screen. It just doesn't work that way. We had a very hard time adjusting it. The desk side planners just did not understand how the filming side worked," end quote.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, a lot of TV, it seems like a movie, like some of the really amazing shows that have been out, and they can be quite cinematic, too, by themselves. But back then, this was not the case, and you were doing all the cinematic stuff in the cinema itself, and TV was just this upstart sort of thing that was in the process of taking everything over the decades. So because this is a podcast that does a whole lot of emphasis on writing and trying to concentrate on the story a little bit more, Sekizawa, this was his first job, as we mentioned in part 1. And you can tell there's humor in it a little bit. The characters are pretty cool. They are some of the archetypes that Sekizawa kept using are in this movie. especially Yuriko. And it sets up a lot of things that Sekizawa would do later. And I could have used a little bit more humor in the second half of the movie, but I'm okay with it. I don't have to put all that many requests into this movie. But I do like the Yuriko character. She's pretty tough.
Yeah, Sekizawa almost always used scientists and reporters. Those were usually his favorite archetypes to use, and also detectives pretty often. So these same archetypes, they always reappear in the future films. I do want to say, to be specific, Varan was his first writing gig for Toho, but he had actually done other films before that. He was actually a co-producer on a movie called Children of the Beehive in 1948. And he was a co-producer / co-director on Buddha and the Children in 1952. And most impressive of all, Sekizawa wrote and directed a sci-fi film for Shintoho in 1956 called Fearful Attack of the Flying Saucers. So Varan was just his first, Toho gig.
I almost want to make some out-of-the-world reference and say that maybe Yuri from GMK was inspired by this character Yuriko in this movie, and she's just like a 2.0 version in GMK. Strong woman, reporter. Maybe there are kind of a lot of similarities. She's smart. She's got backbone. I kind of see that a lot in there.
Well, I hadn't thought of it until you just brought it up, but since GMK technically was supposed to be Anguirus Varana Bearground, maybe it was based on that character. So I think you've got a point there.
And they put part of Varan into Ghidorah, right? Too, the face.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so I sort of wonder where Yuri in GMK came from, because really we got Yuriko in Varan, and the similarities are piling up. And she's not scared like that Horiguchi guy is. And Horiguchi's like the comic relief character playing this like a proto-Frankie Sakai from Mothra situation. But you can see a lot of Sekizawa in this movie. Speaking of projects that were left undone, Sekizawa wrote a scene where children were doing their impressions of Varan. He was way ahead of the curve by trying to put kids into movies like this. I don't believe it was actually filmed, but yeah, kids weren't appearing in Godzilla movies until the second half of the 1960s. And here we are in 1958 with an attempt, at least, of trying to get children involved. The Ikefube soundtrack is pretty good, actually, even considering what this movie ended up, being sort of an underperformer. But I do like the music in it, and Ikefube ends up using sometimes the same melody from this in other movies. And I believe this was also in the first Ghidorah, and then it got used again in Godzilla vs. Gigan. And it's that very specific melody. It was the one that they sang on Saturday Night Live when Godzilla 98 was coming out. Yes.
To me, the two things that really stand out about Varan are the excellent suit that was constructed and also the music. It's really a huge standout for Ifekube's score, and a lot of those themes he would kind of regurgitate in later years and perfect, and you would hear them quite a bit. And I think even in 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, you could hear some of the Varan music.
And also the Natives theme towards the beginning, too, because that and a melody is very similar to that ended up being used for the opening titles to King Kong vs. Godzilla from 1962.
And to take it just a step further, when Varan is approaching the boat of fishermen from behind, some of the music actually kind of sounds like Jaws by John Williams. It predates that. And I would even say that the native chant even is a little bit similar to the chant from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, also by John Williams.
Oh my gosh, I did not think about that.
So sometimes I wonder if Williams had ever seen... He would have to have seen the Japanese version of Varan, of course, because I think for the U.S. version, they actually cut out most of the score, so I wonder.
Yeah, the American version really butchered really excised pretty much all of that soundtrack. Going more to the atmosphere of this movie, we have this mentioned as the Tibet of Japan, and it's in western Tohoku region. Yeah, the village is called the Iwaya Village. It's in the Kunishiroshima Valley. I didn't see anything in on Google Earth with this name, but it is mentioned a few times in the American version. They really love that word.
Yes, and to specify in the American version, they call it Kuno Shiroshima, and they change it from the mountains of Japan to an outlying island off the coast of Japan for some reason.
Yeah, they made a lot of changes to this. There's all of the fog and this whole... The movie talks a lot about mystery and how there's all of this mystery still left in the world, even though we're already in the space age. They mentioned mystery of in the 20th century, which that made me think about that because that's in another movie too. I believe it's the first Ghidorah, right?
That's right. Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. That's what Yuriko Hoshi's character works at Mysteries of the 20th Century.
Yeah, when she's throwing off all the astronomers' chi at the beginning of this movie. Yeah.
I like to pretend that's actually a continuation of the journalistic program in Varan, even though I know it's not. But I like to think that just in my own little world.
Yeah, I thought I may as well think that way.
Because Sekizawa was incredibly notorious for using similar-sounding names. Like there was Professor Mirai and Mothra, and then it became Professor Murai and Ghidorah. And you think they're the same character, but they're actually not.
Yeah, it's just like we have Goro Maki showing up all the time in Godzilla movies too, even though it's obviously not the same guy.
Yep.
So in the Japanese version, he is referred to as Mountain God Baradagi. And it's part of this insular culture, backward deformities. We'll be talking about the Hisabetsu-Buraku in part 3, so we'll learn more from there. The movie was delayed on VHS release until last, because Toho kind of knew about this sort of little cultural insensitivity. As you may recall, Half Human, the story of the abominable snowman, was banned in Japan and still is today because of insensitivity, believed mostly towards the Ainu people, but also the Hisabetsu-Buraku. The ceremonial worship of Varan, that's really going into a lot of kaiju tropes already in this movie. Is we have the whole thing of this predictable moment, really, where we have the outsiders like right behind them as they're worshiping their god, and everybody's watching them, and then all of a sudden they're like, hey, who are these people? And they're like, oops, oh geez, we're standing right behind you. I figured you'd probably turn around and see us at some point. So then they get caught, and then there's all of the sort of predictable things that ensue, but at least in this they're not, attacked or sacrificed or whatever, like in the King Kong remake or anything like that. There is, I have to make this because I really love dogs, but there's a very rare appearance of a dog in a kaiju movie. Final Wars is another one that I think about. And of course I like it. It's a Shiba Inu, which is a dog that's native to Japan. And this is the dog that starts running away from the village, and then the child runs after it. And the child runs into what is assuredly mortal danger. And his mother is screaming and screaming for him to return. And that's actually some of the best acting in the movie. Right there is her being that mortified, and she was really putting her heart into it. And she's totally just practically an extra. But it's a tense moment, and it's well done. Like the way that it's set up, like that part of the movie right there was pretty good. It actually got you concerned, and it got you sort of involved into the movie. I liked it. And obviously, probably the funniest part in the movie is the part where Horiguchi tells the other media people to use a wide-angle lens because it's a really big monster. I really like that.
It's also ironic considering it was shot in widescreen it was shot in full screen and then cropped.
Yeah. But that's very Sekizawan, that line. It's really good. And that's something that you can really only use once in a kaiju movie, and without it being completely ruined, because if you do it a second time, it won't be good. But this is a really good way to land a joke like that. It's just great. I first just thought this was really funny, the part right after this, because the villagers seem very easy to convince that their superstition is just totally BS about Varan, because nobody's seen Varan in the village. It's out there, one of those kind of things. And the whole village goes with them the second time. And I guess all they needed to be told was that, this kid's life was in danger, and boom, the superstition's just gone. And I wish it was that easy to get people to not believe in superstitions, to just say, well, it's a matter of life and death going on here. Who do you care about? What do you care about that? But what's funny is that the villagers don't ever see Varan in their entire lives. And then right after they're convinced that Varan is a superstition, Varan appears and destroys their entire village and kills a whole bunch of them, including the priest of the village. And their superstition is proven to be exactly right. You really don't see that very much in movies. And then Varan flattens the priest, so he didn't even get to tell the villagers, "I told you so." So he doesn't even get that satisfaction. But it was really funny, and I don't know who was responsible for it. If that was all Sekizawa, or if it was somebody else, or if it was just a different scenario to the setup of the natives, worshiping the kaiju. But I just thought it was funny at first. But there is a more serious subtext to this, and that is the part of the story where the crux of the matter is that the outsiders get all of these natives killed and their village destroyed and their village elder flattened, but they aren't the ones that pay the price for it. The natives are the one who pay the price for it. And it's a theme that was actually relatively common in post-war Japanese stories and cinema, because it links back to the whole aspect of what happened during the Great Pacific War. And it was about Japan's military system pretty much getting the country destroyed and a whole bunch of people killed. And it was another way to do a story where, the people in charge of making this change were not the ones who ended up paying for it. And once you see that theme, it's really interesting, because I don't think I've ever seen this happen in an American movie.
I don't know either if it was either Sekizawa or it was Kuronoma that came up with the idea, or possibly even Ishiro Honda, but definitely, yeah, an interesting story concept there.
There's some rather long takes on Varan in his rampage through the village, and about 24 minutes in is when that starts. He's walking around on all fours and he's destroying everything, and it actually is one of the longest takes I've ever seen of a monster destroying something, because usually when you're doing all this action, you do all these really quick cuts, and so either it was rushed or they actually just let it go. Usually it's a lot of very quick cuts, especially stuff like in the first Ghidorah film, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, when he's destroying Tokyo, is a lot of very quick cuts. And it's all just boom, 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 with the sort of Russian constructivist composition. Also, the part with Yuriko getting trapped under the fallen tree and having to be rescued, that made me think of Aegon. Because in Aegon, it's this woman, and she is, really close to Aegon and in mortal danger, and she keeps trying to get away from him. But it reminded me of what Sekizawa would do later with Aegon.
Yeah, since you brought up the scene with the tree, I have to throw it out there. There was actually a deleted scene later where you would have seen Yuriko recovering in the hospital from that injury, and Kinji was going to go see her. And that's one of the extra scenes that was scripted for episode 3 of Varan when it was a TV movie. But I'm not sure if they ever filmed it or if they filmed it and lost the footage, but I know it was definitely in the script.
It's funny, that also reminds me of GMK. And then she's in the hospital?
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe our theory we're coming up with is right. And
maybe I need to do a whole separate episode on the similarities between Varan and GMK. It's one of the rare instances where a main character gets hurt, is in GMK. So talking about Varan, because Varan's an interesting kaiju. So he's a Varanopod, and he's a holdover from the times of the dinosaurs. And I like that he can walk on all fours and on his hind legs sometimes, and that he can sort of glide/fly, and then the spikes on his back are very nice. I like that design. It has some characteristics of a monitor lizard as well, and his last appearance was in 1968 in Destroy All Monsters. I wish that Toho would bring Varan back for a movie again, but at this time it seems rather unlikely. I like that Varan is triphibian. He can fly, swim, and he can walk on land. There's also the relation to a flying squirrel. And so there's just so many different things thrown into this one kaiju. And it is an original idea, but it's kind of like a Frankenstein of a bunch of other ideas all put together. And Varan is different enough from Godzilla that I don't think of him as a Godzilla knockoff or anything. And as more kaiju movies were created, Sekizawa famously said how there are no more monsters later in his career. And this is true, because you can only have so many permutations of all these different kaiju characteristics and attributes. I love how Varan does not have a beam, though, and we don't have to sit through various beam battles later. I'm glad they haven't done that. There's one of the characters, the actual figures of Varan, talks about Varan's origin, and it says that he's in the same family kind of as Rodan, probably because of the flying ability. But that's rather interesting too. But it was a toy, and it said that he's actually related to Rodan.
Interesting.
And then Varan is also related to the Draco, which is the genus of flying dragons. And this is where that flying ability comes from. The connection to yokai is interesting. The Kappa is the yokai that Varan is most closely related to. And the Kappa is an amphibious demon that dwells in ponds and rivers. And if it dries out or if the water in the bowl on its head spills, then it could die. And they like cucumbers, and they like sumo wrestling. They don't like iron, sesame, or ginger. Their behavior can range from just mischievous acts like looking up a woman's kimono to dangerous acts such as murder, rape, kidnapping, and drowning people. But there is a little bit of a yokai connection because of the way he's in the water at the beginning, and then he comes out and then engages in all these activities that are not all that good.
Yeah, and to touch upon what you'd said earlier about being in the same family as Rodan, etc., I think Varan really was meant to be a combination of Godzilla, Rodan, and Anguirus, because, he can fly like Rodan, he's a quadruped like Anguirus, he has the spikes, and then he can also walk upright in a bipedal stance like Godzilla. So I definitely think that figured into his creation and his design, certainly.
And it makes sense that you would have something like this, because you can only do Godzilla so many times. I mean, not the movies, but just the design. And like in Pacific Rim and these movies that have other kaiju in them, they have all these interesting patterns in how they look, and I guess they're unique too, but they're just ones that aren't, not every kaiju has its own movie, but this one does.
Yeah, and to talk about his other lone film appearance in Destroy All Monsters, fans think he only has 2 scenes in the movie. He actually has 3 if you really look closely. In the first scene in the Monsterland Control Center, believe it or not, on one of those monitors, if you look up close, you can see Manda and Varan. Not together, they're in different monitors, but you have to look really close, but you can actually tell that's who are on these other screen monitors. So he actually has 3 scenes in Destroy All Monsters.
I'll have to press pause the next time I look at that, because I think most people are concentrating on Son of Godzilla when they're looking at all those monitors, and then they probably didn't. Their eyes didn't go towards Varan as much.
Well, how you can tell there's these publicity photos of Varan and Manda both that you think don't appear in the film, but they actually do. There's one of Varan leering over a rock, and that's actually the scene that you see on the monitor is that little Varan puppet kind of coming up over a rock. So it's actually the third piece of our original footage of Varan in the film. And also after Destroy All Monsters, believe it or not, Varan was at one point scripted for what became Godzilla vs. Gigan. What happened was Shinichi Sekizawa wrote a script, and in his script, he had Godzilla, Rodan, and Varan taking on Gigan, King Ghidorah, and this new alien monster called Mogu. So I think maybe Sekizawa had a kind of a soft spot for Varan, because that was the first Toho monster movie he ever wrote. Maybe he just wanted to bring the monster back, and I would guess the main reason he got the cut pretty quick was there just was no Varan suit to actually use, as opposed to Anguirus, where there was a suit. So that's probably why poor old Varan got the axe from Godzilla vs. Gigan. Most of the more diehard Godzilla fans really would have preferred GMK to be Baragon, Varan, and Anguirus as opposed to Mothra and King Ghidorah. Toho was just looking at the big box office numbers, they felt like more people would be interested in seeing Mothra and King Ghidorah return, which I don't necessarily think was true at the point of the Millennium films. I think the Millennium films had lost so much interest by the time that they were released, it really wouldn't have made a difference which monsters they used, but that's just my opinion.
It might not have, and I think they were just probably going for, like, people who make movies, the way that they put actors into movies. You know, it's almost like, well, do we want these less popular actors that a lot of people like, or do we want the most popular actors? It's kind of like they were just working with actors who were human beings too. But yeah, I get that, and I don't think that it would have made much of a difference. So the where's all the wind coming from in this the first half of the movie? Because we have all this fog and the atmosphere is really great and everything, but then we get all the wind, which I'm guessing is created by Varan, but but the wind kind of undermines the fog. You can't really have both at the same time.
Yeah. I think the wind is tied into that yokai aspect you brought up earlier, that Varan has kind of like this supernatural aspect to him. So I would say that's the answer.
That's a really cool principle, too, to have a sort of natural disaster, or at least a natural atmosphere sort of pervading the kaiju. And the part about Varan and his skin, they say that the skin isn't hard, it's just that everything bounces off of him.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, hey, wait a minute, that's actually a good idea. That's something you can probably only do once. It's a unique idea. And then after this is sort of like obligatory things. Obligatory air battle. We have our sea battle scenes that are a little long, but you need to show people stuff in this because it's action, so you got to have it. I feel like this movie had trouble with keeping momentum. Like, the first half was all unique and interesting, and a lot of it was in this outdoor atmosphere, but then we go to by the numbers way of making a kaiju film. You know, we get our air battle, sea battle, depth charges. We even have our landing vehicles. It's like a mini invasion on the coast of Normandy sort of thing there at Haneda with the troop ships unloading.
Yeah, and I would definitely say just that the pacing problem was basically due to that episodic nature, where it really was, meant to be 4 episodes focusing on this aspect and that aspect. So yeah, it definitely had an effect on the momentum.
And then the plane crashes right into Varan. You really can't blame him for that, can you?
Yeah.
It's an impressive plane, though. The model that crashes into him, it's huge.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that's almost a scale issue, too. I felt like...
Because the fighters were a lot smaller. But yeah, I wondered where the big, huge model for this plane came from. But I was like, wow, that is big. And I agree. It's probably scale.
You're probably right. I bet those naval destroyers and the planes probably came from one of Toho's old war movies, and they were recycled. That's just a guess.
Yeah, I could see where it would come from a war movie. That makes sense. The water explosions, they look good, especially the one with the multiple depth charges all circling him, all going off at once. That looks pretty nice, actually. And even though it doesn't hurt Varan at all, but I think it's impressive. The music from the naval artillery attack scenes would eventually be used in Godzilla vs. Gigan, in the parts where our human characters are doing their research on our Switzerland-based multinational corporation owned by the, cockroach aliens.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's a very military-ish thing. But of course, a lot of what Ikefube did, a lot of it sounded like military marches when he got down to it. The bomb that Dr. Fujimura creates, it's an interesting bomb because they say out of nowhere that he invented it, but then he has it all ready for a presentation there queued up, but he doesn't want to use it. But then it does great damage inside something, but not outside it.
Yeah, that was definitely...
Whoever thought of that, because a bomb is a bomb,
yeah.
I thought, but never mind. But it's,
yeah, well, speaking of a bomb is just a bomb, I think the Ken Kuranuma's treatment just ended with a jet fighter crashing into a fuel reserve at Haneda Airport, right. And that engulfs Varan and kills him. So that was the original ending, which is a bit simpler.
and it's a kaiju movie. I'm not going to pull the why isn't this realistic thing? This is probably the kaiju genre is probably one of the genres that you least want to try to pull the reality card on, but it's an awesome weapon, and as part of the fun is being able to have all these amazing weapons. Mm-hmm. Definitely my favorite one is the Dimension Tide from Mechagoras. It's just so awesome. It's just pure kaiju technology. Great technology for a kaiju film.
Yeah.
This was, however, it did injure Nakajima. Yeah. The large explosion that was sort of under him when the vehicle is blown up.
I do recall that. Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and it burned him some. It was a pretty big explosion to have right under the suit. The model of Haneda Airport looks pretty good, actually, the buildings. And they would perfect this later with another film that we're going to do, which is War of the Gargantuas, where they had a wonderful Haneda model and set built up. But it's pretty amazing to relocate the HQ closer to the danger, where they're like, we need to move our headquarters closer.
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of Shin Godzilla. We need to get out of the blast zone kind of thing. And instead it's like, well, we're going to go right to the airport and we're going to order everybody around right from there, as if that's a safe place to conduct that kind of an operation. But there's lots of obligatory moments and events, and it's a pretty cut and dry movie, pretty standard in many ways. There are evacuation scenes, but there isn't one of those heavy gravity kind of hospital scenes that shows everybody injured and all that, like GMK did that too. The idea of Varan eating the flares and then attaching the bombs to the flares is clever. This had been done in a similar way to Godzilla Raids Again, because of him being drawn to fires and flares and stuff like that in the dark. And they're exploiting a characteristic of Varan that ends up being his downfall.
Yeah, and that's a little more interesting and well thought out than another proto-climax was, instead of the flares, they attached the bombs to balloons, which he would have swallowed for who knows what reason. So it definitely makes more sense to have him attracted to light, and he swallows the flares.
The ending is slightly sad, really, because the whole story is about man having another triumph over nature. And it's very much, they don't really milk it for the emotion as much as something like King Kong did. I don't know, at the end of the day, it's like, who cares about if humanity wins or whatever? I like Varan. So
yeah,
they could have really pushed it further, but there are already quite a few similarities to King Kong in this movie happen already. The American version of this is pretty bad, isn't it?
Yeah, and to be precise, they actually cut out 57 minutes of the Japanese footage, and they added in 68 minutes of American footage. So it's pretty extreme. No, I'm sorry, they added in 40 minutes of the American footage, so it's pretty extreme cut.
It's not like a funny kind of bad. It's more just a moderately painful bad. And I've seen a lot of bad movies. I'm a big Mystery Science Theater fan. This movie, the American version, it just sits there. And even in moments when things happen, it seems like things really aren't happening. And I'm familiar with Myron Healey because I remember the MST3K movie, The Unearthly, which that also had Carradine in it. And that to me is like a 9 out of 10 on the pain scale. Like the cinematic pain scale is way up there. The Unearthly is a very tough one to get through, even when you're watching the Mystery Science Theater version. And the actors in the American version of this are TV actors, so I'm not going to treat this like they're in the same league as movie actors. But Varan the Unbelievable, it makes me like the Japanese version more. Because I went back and I saw the Japanese version and I was like, oh, this isn't all that bad. Again, I'm like grading it on a curve because comparing it to the American version really is rather amazing. I don't understand, though, that the IMDb ratings of these aren't further apart.
I think people don't know what they're voting for, probably.
I don't think so.
Yeah, but it's like, I'm sure this got to be further apart than that. But
And the thing about Varan the Unbelievable is when you watch it, it makes you realize just how well done, by comparison, Godzilla King of the Monsters is with Raymond Burr.
Absolutely.
Raymond Burr's character, Steve Martin, he's very likable. The story flows well. He actually interacts with the Japanese cast. Myron Healey in Varan the Unbelievable is Commander Bradley. He's not very likable. He's very patronizing to his wife and the rest of the Japanese cast. He doesn't actually interact with any of the actors from the original Varan. It's just, it's very awkward, and it brings the momentum to a standstill.
Yeah, and it makes me want the Japanese actors back in the movie a lot. The sequence involving fixing the broken radio, that had me on the edge of my seat.
Yeah, well, maybe there was a problem with the American script. Who knows? Maybe at one point they wrote Myron Healey into the command center scenes, and then they decided, oh, wait, we don't have the budget to try and match that set, so we'll just have him out on the Jeep radio. Who knows? Because it's really awful.
Yeah, and the acting is pretty bad, and the movie's not entertaining much at all. It's hilarious that the girlfriend thinks she's to blame for all the unfortunate occurrences because she convinced him to keep the people on this island, quote unquote, instead of making them evacuate. But then he tells her, oh, it's not anyone's fault, even though I'm pretty sure some of this was his fault. And then other things in this movie, like they dubbed Varan's roar, and that made me think of Gigantus the Fire Monster, which is another really bad American version of a kaiju film.
Yeah.
And the first half hour is definitely the worst part of this American version. The part about getting a chemical to turn salt water into fresh water was an intriguing idea, but really that's just window dressing. You know, it doesn't really go anywhere. And that's not really what's important in the movie. And I'm not a fan of really any of these English language versions. Obviously, King of the Monsters of 1956 is the best one. But whether it's Gigantus the Fire Monster or any of these others, I don't really like them. I don't know if you saw the Mystery Science Theater related film called The Creeping Terror, but it made me think of Creeping Terror.
No, I have not.
We had narrators, and that movie actually had two narrators, and then all the canned music and the sort of bad plot. American version pretty well is not all that great. And you know about Crown International Pictures, the group that made this?
I know the name, and that's about it. They did a few other sci-fi films. Did they do the Crater Lake Monster? Am I wrong? Is that one that they did? Yes, they did. I just looked at my notes. They did the Beast of Yucca Flats in 1961 and the Crater Lake Monster in 1977. And there's probably a few others. Those are just the two that I picked out.
The ones that stood out to me the most were Beast of Yucca Flats, the Skydivers, which is that Coleman Francis one. You can't get much lower than that. And then Catalina Caper, one of the older Mystery Science Theater episodes that was one of the, I believe it was on Volume 1 that they released that of on the Mystery Science Theater DVD collections. And also Bloodlust and the Hellcats and Wild Rebels and the Side Hackers. All of those were Crown International Pictures. That is a frightening list.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more to this list too if you look it up on and look at what they all produced. But those ones that I mentioned were the ones that were absolutely some of the most infamous Mystery Science Theater episodes ever. And the corporation, it went to Chapter 11 in 1992. So that's what ended up happening to Crown International Pictures. But yeah, especially Beast of Yucca Flats and Skydivers for sure. Oh my gosh. And we don't get to the next level of kaiju films until 1961's Mothra, really. That's when really the prime part of the golden era of Japanese cinema goes. The original Mothra is one of my favorite movies ever, and you can see quite a bit of it. Of the way that he would create stories, you saw it in this. And that's one thing that's really cool with Varan.
I do think Varan's failure might have actually led to the reason why Toho didn't do any giant monster movies for about 2.5 years. And something else I think is interesting is, Tomoyuki Tanaka, he insisted that the Mysterians have a giant monster in it. That was 1957, but after Varan, I don't think he insisted the same thing with Battle in Outer Space. There was no monster inserted into it, so I kind of wonder if Varan kind of soured him on giant monsters for just a little while.
Yeah, it might have. Well, that concludes part 2, and I will move on to our related topic next. You're listening to KVR Kaijuvision Radio. In part 3 of the podcast, I will be analyzing a topic that was either brought up in the film or was going on at the time of the film's release. And for this episode, I chose the Hisabetsu-Buraku, and that is because, like in episode 38 on Half Human, this episode is an opportunity to get a topic like this some exposure. I'll immediately delve into very interesting history. The literal Japanese translation of Burakumen is dwellers in hamlets. The way this works is that Hisabetsu-Buraku are discriminated communities. So that's the community, and then the Hisabetsu-Burakumen is the often used term, and that it means people of the discriminated community. In 2016, the Abe government passed a bill through the Diet acknowledging discrimination against the Hisabetsu-Buraku communities, and it says that the government should eliminate that discrimination. Now, when you have a caste system, and there are some who get preferential treatment and a prominent place in society, there are those who get excluded, and we get social pariahs. In the book Trust by Francis Fukuyama, he compares China and Japan's social structures. He wrote that Japan is like a block of granite, and China is like a pile of sand. The bonds of trust in Japan are very strong, but what do you get when the block of granite doesn't assimilate you? Well, you have to make do with what you have. You govern yourself, and you make a living, and you survive. Talking about this topic makes me think about other discriminated peoples. Every country seems to have them. The Ainu and the Ryukyuans in Japan are examples. The Roma in Europe are another. People with different gender identities and sexual orientation are discriminated against all over the world. In many parts of the world, particularly the Middle East, women are heavily discriminated against. Religious persecution in certain areas of the world is particularly bad, as some countries are favorable towards one religion while rejecting the others. Going further back in Japan's history, which was 1603 to 1868, so more recent history, and that was during the Tokugawa shogunate. That was when the caste system was developed. It lasted until 1871, when Emperor Meiji ordered it abolished. However, there remains residual discrimination afterwards because something like that doesn't just disappear. Even before the caste system was established, though, there were certain professions that were looked at as impure because of the concern of defilement. There's an entire class of jobs like this, including funeral services, grave diggers, undertakers, butchers, tanners, bounty hunters, executioners, even carnival workers, and also people who do menial work. There is a religious taboo with both Buddhism and Shinto in Japan that has problems with jobs that involve defilement. Confucianism was the basis for the 4-part caste system that lasted for quite a while in Japan. First and foremost were the scholars, second were the farmers, third were the artisans and craftspeople, and then the merchants and traders were the fourth one. And they had Burakumen even wear certain colors to give everyone the heads up that, this is what their place in society is. And that is the basis for the 4-part caste system. There was these 4 parts, and then the Burakumen, Hisabetsu-Burakumen, that were right there. They were kept in the occupations that they were specifically given to. In other words, it's a good way because there was no competition from other Japanese in these particular areas, and a lot of these were jobs that needed to be done. They were in certain districts by themselves often, and they were even autonomous somewhat with regards to governance. After the Meiji Restoration, there were a lot of things in Japan that got modernized, and so the Hisabetsu-Burakumen got declassified, but obvious things still existed. History goes a very long time in Japan. All of the families used to be registered so everyone knew what was going on. Buraku is a hereditary distinction, so the family registration, which was public, which was used to check up on who really was who. Marriage discrimination was one of the key ways that the discrimination went against the Hisabetsu-Buraku men, so they would check to see if there was any connection to the Buraku men. This type of discrimination has been made illegal. It used to be nearly no one would marry a Hisabetsu-Buraku man, but now that is reversing substantially as a trend. As time went on, the government got around to setting up a policy of assimilation. Economic and infrastructure development of those communities began in order to level out the differences between them and the rest of Japan. These were called Doha projects. This effort really took off in the late 1960s. In 1969, a special measures law for assimilation projects was passed. It was to raise the standard of living in those communities, and that program ended in 2002, sort of declaring a success. This issue of discrimination against the Hisabetsu-Buraku men is more often in Western Japan than in Eastern Japan, particularly the Kansai region, and the biggest cities in that region are Osaka, Kyoto, and Kobe. Hiroshima is also one that is prevalent, though. Even though there was a policy of assimilation, in 1975 there was a 330-page book being sold to many corporations and individuals which have the lists of names of all of the Hisabetsu-Buraku men and even what their professions and addresses were. This book would then be used for employment discrimination, marriage discrimination, and whatever other discrimination that they saw fit to commit. The book was banned from being sold or produced. Even then, though, there are still copies floating around. Regarding economics, though, the Hisabetsu-Buraku men were dealt a blow by the 1871 change to their status because it meant that other Japanese would be able to compete in the job fields that the Hisabetsu-Buraku men had all to themselves previously. This was another reason why nearly 100 years after the change in status, they needed economic development from the government in order to raise their standard of living. The other blow to the Hisabetsu-Buraku men was that the public data about all of these programs was public knowledge, so just like the book, the data could be used to discriminate in hiring and in marriage. The National Levelers Society was formed in 1922, and its goal was to level out the differences in society between the Hisabetsu-Buraku men and the rest of the society. After the war, the BLL was formed, and that is what is called the Buraku Liberation League. This group says that there are many more Hisabetsu-Buraku men than the official government numbers say, like 3 times more, 3 million versus 1 million. Nowadays, there isn't as much discrimination in Japan against the Hisabetsu-Buraku men. The prevailing attitude now is that the jobs that someone's ancestors had is not important and in fact doesn't make sense anymore. Modern attitudes are changing people's outlooks, but there is still name-calling and sort of bigoted attitudes depending on where you go and who you talk to. An unfortunate incident occurred in 2001 when debate was going on about who would be the next prime minister. Taro Aso of the Liberal Democratic Party asked, "We are not going to let someone from the Buraku become prime minister, are we?" And Hiromu Nonaka withdrew his name from consideration for the PM position after Aso said that. Aso ended up becoming prime minister for a time, and he is currently now the finance minister in Prime Minister Abe's cabinet. By the late 2000s, a lot of the assimilation had taken place, and many in Japan considered the issue solved. However, like most social issues, this will never fully go away. This is a subject that not many in Japan talk about, and Japan is trying hard to make this issue go away, mostly by solving it with government programs and by public awareness, and by just letting things happen the way they are now. There is, of course, an argument going on regarding how best to solve the problem. It's the side of the argument that says there should be no labels and the side that says yes to labels. Some, including the Japanese Communist Party, say that making labels only makes it worse. However, that doesn't seem to be the prevailing attitude, but both sides have the same goal of ameliorating the difference. It's just about the method. I'd say that the most economic freedom possible would be the best way to raise the standard of living for them, for sure, and allowing economic development to be able to spread to as many people as possible. In America, the case with this kind of phenomenon is different. In the book Snobbery in America, the author said, In Europe, it's about who you are, and in America, it's about what you do, meaning snobbery. Professions are discriminated against in America because ancestry and noble blood isn't very big of an issue, so professions marry each other, and a profession isn't prestigious. If it isn't prestigious, then it's viewed as a step down. It's very much a class system in America, but this kind of dynamic really isn't talked about in America very much. Just like ageism isn't talked about in America very much. So the Hisabetsu-Buraku men are not portrayed in this movie in a very positive light. Between this and Half Human is definitely worse, especially with the head priest of the village beating up what's-her-name. But this one is still a problem. It's why the VHS was released last out of the Kaiju set in the 80s, but it's in its full version now, and we can see the whole thing and be grown-ups about looking at the past. I would give you economic figures of note, but we do not have GDP figures for Japan until 1960 and after. Well, thank you very much, John, for coming on as a guest co-host. Really good writer, and we interviewed you at G-Fest. You should, anybody who's listening now, you can check out the interview with John on the playlist for the podcast as well. And he has just released this latest book, which is Terror of the Lost Tokusatsu Films, which is really good. I read it, and I have it here with me. You can look up John on Amazon.com, and you can find all of his books there. I also saw your main Kaiju book. I have that as well, and that's also very good. And I will be trying to get more titles as well. And it's really great that you're such a good part of the G-Fan community, and you have done a lot of research for everybody and been able to enlighten a lot of people on the Kaiju films, and especially on these amazing, interesting processes that happen behind the scenes.
Well, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that, and I also really look forward to coming back later in the season, if it all works out, when we talk about the submersion of Japan.
Which is one of the main reasons why I did this season. It's actually that, because it's one of my absolute favorites, and there's not even a kaiju in it. I would like to dedicate this episode to Keizo Murase, who was at G-Fest 25, and he is a master prop and master suit builder. Now, this is important because Varan is one of the suits that he designed, and it looks great. I really like it. It's wonderful. And he also did the suit building for Mothra, King Ghidorah, Baragon, Titanosaurus, and he even went on to do Gamera and Daimajin. So this is a very talented man. I was able to meet him at G-Fest. It was really nice. But this guy is like massively, huge figure in classic Toho, especially Kaiju movies. So very awesome. His work has been seen by millions and millions of people. Very wonderful job that he did. The next episode of this podcast will be 1959's The Three Treasures, which is about Shinto and stars the incomparable Toshiro Mifune. I'd like to send a shout out to our patron Sean Stiff. Thank you for your support. I really appreciate it. Donating is worth it. It's the inside track to what's going on in the show, and you get to message me personally. If you'd like to send some feedback, I'd love to hear from you. The email address is feedback@kaijuvision.com. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Kaijuvision Radio is available on Google Play, iTunes, Stitcher, Blueberry, TuneIn, Podcast Addict, YouTube with scenic videos, and on kaijuvision.com. If you like the podcast, please donate on Patreon. I'm Brian Scherschel.
And I'm John LeMay.
And this is KVR, Kaijuvision Radio. See you next time.